Well, welcome back from your Thanksgiving break. I hope you all had a jolly time. If it couldn't be with family, at least maybe Zoom calls or something related to that, some kind of modest celebration of Thanksgiving. We have a lot to be thankful for. Uh, so we should press on now and talk some more about the end of the Cold War, the phase that it went through in the 1980s, and the phase that it went through in the 1980s, and the role played in the end of the Cold War by the Reagan administrations, George Bush administrations, and by Gorbachev and his leadership, and especially, of course, by Gorbachev. I will be stressing that Gorbachev is going to be the key actor, and he's the key person we need to explain. Gorbachev represents a kind of summing up of all of the tendencies and problems that we've been discussing throughout the whole course. And so Gorbachev will look at it pretty much that way, and he will make a conscious effort to end the Cold War, and that's the thing that is going to finally end the Cold War, although not, of course, in the form that anybody anticipated. Nobody understood that it could end the way it did. That Soviet Union, that is to say, or Soviet communism would lose the Cold War, and the United States and American capitalism and American democracy, if you want to think of it that way, would win the Cold War. Nobody supposed that that would be the case, and that's the reason that the historian really has his task cut out for him, trying to explain this. That, in many ways, that's what makes it interesting. The heavy burden that is on the shoulders of the historian. So anyhow, we have to start today talking about Reagan and talking about the period between 1980 and 1988 when Ronald Reagan was in power. So those are the two terms of Ronald Reagan's presidency in the United States, and they mark a very different approach to the Cold War as opposed to the approach that we were describing previously in the 1970s, which had generally been regarded by, I think you have to say, by American ruling elites, had generally been regarded as a failure, that the United States was losing the Cold War. And I don't think that this is a wrong judgment. I think that they were looking at something real, looking at genuine communist geopolitical gains on three continents. It's absolutely wrong to say that the United States contained the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. No, not so. Containment is a failure. George Kennan's idea of containment in 1947, it's a failure by the 1980s. By the time Reagan comes into office, the Soviet Union is gaining on three continents. Geopolitically, it looks like it's in the driver's seat. Strategically, Reagan made it out that the Soviets were gaining in terms of the strategic balance with nuclear weapons. And he did that for various political reasons. He wanted to support the military-industrial complex in the United States, wanted to use the arms race against the Soviet Union in the Cold War in an anti-communist role in American foreign policy, and that, of course, is not so easily available to the proponent of détente, for example, such as Henry Kissinger. So Henry Kissinger is in a position where he wants good relations, essentially good relations with the Soviet Union in the nuclear sphere. Although he insists on linkage, and he says that Soviet Union shouldn't behave in the third world, and that's part of the bargain. That's why we give them arms control, which is something they want, and they give us a placid world. They quiet down the revolutions going on all over the world and the activities of communists, the activities of Cubans, the activities of other communists in the world. So that's part of the bargain of détente with linkage, as Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon saw the matter in the 1970s. But this period is different because it judges that that was all a big failure, too soft on the Soviets. Say the cowboy opponents of the Yankee of the Yankee Nixon administration, Nixon and Kissinger, and Nelson Rockefeller and the Trilateral Commission and all of the rest of those elite organizations in the background as the criticism from the right made the case throughout the 70s against Kissinger. And it began to crystallize around the figure of Ronald Reagan from California. So today we have to talk about that. And I'm talking about it in terms of this cowboy-Yankee analogy, which of course has been overdone a little bit, but generally I think it's kind of helpful for us to understand the struggles that go on among the American elites during the Cold War. They have a different attitude toward the Cold War, and they represent a sectional phenomenon in the United States. So we'll talk more about that today. Today I'm going to approach it by saying that the cowboys are in power. And it's kind of interesting figuratively to see Ronald Reagan, who played cowboys in the movies, among other things, representing essentially this cowboy tendency in politics, this right wing of the Republican Party coming out of the American Sun Belt. So if we have détente with the Yankees, organized around the Trilateral Commission and organized around Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger during the 70s, if we have détente, we can talk about the rise and fall of détente as we have been speaking through that period. And the premise of the criticism that comes from the other side, from the cowboys, from the southern part of the United States, including Southern California, of course, the premise is that the Soviets have been winning the Cold War throughout the Nixon-Kissinger era. So they have a lot to reference in this regard. The United States defeat in Vietnam. They can talk about how the United States is falling apart, it's disunited, how the Civil Rights Movement has torn the United States apart, and that the Black Revolution, represents something fatal to American continuity, American traditions. They can complain about the collapse of Bretton Woods. That happened in 1971 when Nixon first came into office. And they can also argue that Nixon's response to all these challenges was inadequate. They can say that détente, in effect, gave up the card of nuclear diplomacy that was always available to be played for this nuclear peace with the Soviets. But of course, it was not all defeats in the 70s. Or maybe a better way of putting that is that there were results of the defeats of the 70s that boded well for the Cold Warriors in the United States. And I'm thinking here of the defection of China from the Sino-Soviet bloc as it had been imagined, existing from 1949, increasingly, as we were indicating last time, and as you've been reading in Elbaum, the Chinese are breaking with the Soviets, and the Cultural Revolution, of course, is a big symbol of that, and an enabler of that break with the Soviets by wiping out those pro-Soviet elements in China who wanted to come to terms with the Soviet Union. And Mao, of course, absolutely against that, and willing to purge these elements from the party and really to rusticate them, send them out into the countryside. And it's a struggle against Soviet influence, although it advertises itself in China as a renovation and a renewal of the revolutionary spirit. I think it's actually both things. Those ideas are not exclusive. It's both things. But at any rate, the Chinese are increasingly during the 70s coming over to the United States side, and they're going to be very much on the side of the United States from this point on, almost to the end of the Cold War. I'll be saying almost until 1989. Moreover, the background of the thing, which I guess figures into our calculation about the Cold War, the economic background, the whole world capitalism is going through what might even be seen as kind of death agony through these oil shocks and the renovation, or I should say the a rearrangement of all of the money payments throughout the entire world that takes place in the 1970s. And of course, it will continue throughout the 1980s. So all these things are shaping up, and that kind of looks good for the Soviets on the whole. I think if you're looking at the thing from the standpoint of Moscow, you say capitalism is falling apart. Look, they don't have a gold standard anymore. Look at these oil shocks. They're tearing apart all the economic arrangements that capitalists have enjoyed in the third world, and they're going to tear them apart still more. And moreover, we communists are gaining all over the world. We're gaining in Africa, and as this map indicates, we're gaining in the Congo and Angola and Mozambique, and of course we have defended our Cuban bastion. We're making inroads elsewhere. At the end of the 70s, there's a revolution in Nicaragua, and that immediately spills over into a revolution in El Salvador. So in Central America, the communist cause, the revolutionary cause, the anti-US cause, looks quite vital, and looks to have superb prospects. Moreover, the United States is completely defeated in Southeast Asia. Vietnam has gone by the board. It's now communist. Moreover, we have communist regimes in Laos and in Cambodia. By the end of the period, the Soviet pro-Soviet communists are leading pro-Vietnamese, pro-Soviet communists are leading in Cambodia. The pro-Chinese communist Pol Pot regime, the United States, of course, supported. They've gone by the board as well. So communist cause seems to be advancing on various levels in various ways throughout the world, and all looks good for communism. That's the case, I guess. I'm making this same case, by the way, and this is interesting for us. I would practically make the same case if I were trying to characterize the viewpoint from Moscow about the condition of the Cold War. That is to say, things are going our way. Try to compare that with the view in the criticism of the cowboys, the Reaganites in the United States, of the Nixon-Kissinger détente. It would be almost the same view. So maybe that convinces me that maybe there's something to it, that you don't have to look at it from one point of view to get the essential dynamic of it from the standpoint of the historian. That looking at it from different points of view, they have the same set of facts that they have to process in order to make their analysis. So there we are. That, I think, is the general, state of the balance of forces on the advent of the Reagan administration, which won the election in 1980, defeating the Democrats and Jimmy Carter. And of course, behind the Democrats is the Trilateral Commission with David Rockefeller, and what you might call this modern republicanism, as it might have been defined from the time of Dwight Eisenhower. This kind of moderate and, collaborationist perspective, at least collaborationist from the perspective of the New Deal's welfare state. It did not seek to destroy the welfare state. It did not attack big government and say that big government had to be drowned in a bathtub, the way Grover Norquist put it on behalf of the Reagan administration and subsequent administrations. So this point of view is undergoing considerable criticism from the Cowboys. So the Cowboys get on top in the election in 1980, and interestingly, getting on top in this election. Let's see if I can make my slides do something. Well, there is my characterization of the advance of communism as it would have been seen in a fascist cartoon from the 1930s. Not so much different from the way it is seen from a contemporary cartoon. The advance of all these Chinese countries against the poor, hapless United States, and of course the role of oil in the whole thing. that the advance of Reagan to power then represents this Sun Belt in the United States. So these are the states. Now, essential dynamic of Reaganism, um, some kind of an attachment, and Barry Goldwater is the precursor in 1964, but some kind of an attachment between Southern California perspectives, Southwestern perspectives, you might say, and perspectives of the Cotton South. Some kind of union between those two. So union about skepticism and hostility, really, toward civil rights, um, about the opposition to the Rockefellers and to everything they represent in American capitalism. That say all this soft, New Dealish kind of class collaborationism. They want it much more vibrant, much more nervy kind of capitalism that um, doesn't care very much about compromise with its opponents, wants to defeat them, beat them down. Strongly anti-communist, but about as strongly anti-liberal, anti-welfare state, anti-Roosevelt, anti-New Deal, you have to say. These are the perspectives of the Sun Belt, and Reagan comes to symbolize them on coming to office. And as we were indicating already, already a cowboy, at least in terms of his sensibilities. He wasn't a real cowboy who grew up on a ranch or anything like that. He never actually worked as a cowboy, not saying anything like that. He was a cowboy in the movies. He's an actor. But he readily took to the role and took it over into life. If you ever travel to a place like Santa Fe, where a lot of rich tourists from the surrounding areas come in to buy trinkets, produced by the Native American tribes in the area, and you see the kind of stuff they wear, 10-gallon hats and big belt buckles that say Tex on them, and that sort of thing. Reagan was that sort of personality, not a real cowboy, but you might say a play cowboy, and like many of us are, who buy cowboy paraphernalia at the stores and march around with this stuff. And Reagan had played this role in the movies, took naturally to it, and of course it's a superb political image, especially for this political point of view that we've been describing. Also, the image of a football player, the Gipper. George Gipp, you may not know, but some of you may know that George Gipp was an old-time football player for Notre Dame. In the 1920s, I think it was. Newt Rockne was his coach. There was a movie about Newt Rockne that was made, and Ronald Reagan played George Gipp, and he won a big game at the end of it. Win one for the Gipper, and frequently people referred to Ronald Reagan because of that role that he played in that film as the Gipper. George Gipp, football player, that sort of hero figure. His first marriage was to the glamorous actress Jane Wyman, Academy Award-winning actress, and his enemies always said about Ronald Reagan that he was a B movie actor. That's unfair. That's unfair. Those were not B movies that Ronald Reagan was in. Those were first-run movies. They made a lot of money. Reagan did well in them. Reagan was a good actor, as a matter of fact. It's wrong to say he was a bad actor. The roles he took, he was good. He just wasn't quite the top banana, the top lead. He didn't get the girl always in these films. Oh, sometimes he did, but not always. Did not always get the girl. And so you could say maybe that he played a sort of subsidiary role to a person like Errol Flynn in some of the movies, really big hero, swashbuckling hero. But not a B actor, a good actor, and there were some good films. He was proud of King's Row. Check out King's Row on Netflix if you do that kind of thing. If you want to see Ronald Reagan in a decent movie, and there are some other decent movies that Reagan was in, but he would never quite got the very top, Brad Pitt heroic stardom, the thing they're all shooting after, and she was bucking for that category in terms of female actresses. Jane Wyman had won an Academy Award for a film she was in, a very serious film, kind of grisly film about a poor deaf mute named Johnny Belinda. And so Jane Wyman had certain pretensions as an actor. There's a little tension, apparently, it's sometimes said, a little tension between them because of her being a little bit more legit, more serious, more brilliantly successful. But they were both very, very successful. She was a glamour girl, of course, very stunning, stunning looking human being. And they had a lovely marriage with 2 children. So things are going okay for the Reagans. He was a liberal. He led the Actors Union, Screen Actors Guild. And he was a pro-Roosevelt. He was a liberal. But at a certain point, when there developed a Red Scare in Hollywood, and the activities of the House Un-American Activities Committee began to center on Hollywood, not because Hollywood was the center of any special communist gains or any communist propaganda the way they made out. That wasn't the reason. It's just that they got in the papers. When they attacked Hollywood, they were attacking famous people, as we've already said. And that's the reason they went after Hollywood, for communists, in order to purge communists. Well, anyhow, this was happening, and Reagan sort of had to make a decision about it. And without going into this in great detail, there's a certain amount of literature about this, and I don't want to get to pronouncing about it. It's a little bit out of our way. But somehow he decided he was not going to defend any of the communists in the film industry, and so he kind of turned on them, named names, gave information to American intelligence agencies about communist activity. Communist activity in films. This is ridiculous and pathetic, but there it is. So he fingered people and did things like that. And it was a political decision he made, and maybe a career move, who knows. I don't want to get into interpreting all of that, but the change started to come right after World War II, affected his marriage, and he and Jane Wyman did not see eye to eye about all this anti-communism and this fingering and all the rest of that stuff, which means, of course, fingering people you know and maybe even friends and whatever. And that came between them. I guess there were other things that came between them. I don't want to get into marriage counseling here, but they drifted apart, and their marriage was ruined. And he fell in with Nancy Davis, who played opposite him in Hellcats of the Navy. So he went, another one of the heroic roles that he was in. He really imagined that he had done all these things later on in life. All these things that he had done in the movies, he imagined and told people about them, things he had actually done. He didn't leave the United States during World War II. He was never in the service or anything like that. But he did play these people, and pretty well, actually. He was a good actor. He and Nancy Davis started to make beautiful music together, and they were soon to get married. Nancy Davis had different politics from Jane Wyman. She was connected with Southern California Republicans of the extreme right variety. Holmes Tuttle, a used car dealer, extreme right-winger. Henry Salvatore, anti-communist crusader, donator to the Hoover Institution and other anti-communist causes. And so she was connected to people, and she connected Ronald Reagan to people. And so they made a different kind of music from this point on. Man of the extreme right. So extreme anti-communism, and moreover, instead of being a New Dealer, now a man who's essentially hostile to all those economic reforms that have been made during the New Deal in the United States and want to wipe them out. Although he's always going to say that President Roosevelt was wonderful and he models himself after Roosevelt, but it's all make-believe. It's for, he's an actor, and it's all make-believe. In fact, it's the politics of the extreme right from this point on for Ronald Reagan. He fell right into it, made himself a spokesman for various big businesses, tied up with General Electric, made propaganda speeches, found he was fantastic at it. Not just good, but on a level, Well, he's an actor, and he was a good actor. Um, so I'm not saying he was insincere either. It's just that he had the talent to project ideas. Put a microphone in front of him, give him a script, and he was dynamic. Um, so there he is. He becomes president in 1980. A little odd maneuvering accompanied the advent of Reagan to power. Some maneuvering over the Mid East, which has come to be known as the Iran-Contra Affair. Well, this is the beginnings of it. As you see from this headline, the New York Times, the Iranians were holding hostages during the Carter administration. Walter Cronkite, CBS News, used to come on and announce his broadcast every night by saying it's day 162 of the hostage situation, that the revolutionary Iranian regime is holding American hostages. And so there's this terrible thing wearing on Carter throughout Carter's presidency, this issue that the Iranian regime held hostages and the Americans really couldn't do anything about it. Zbigniew Brzezinski had tried a special op in order to try to free them, but it went sour. The helicopters involved in it crashed into one another. Gee, it just went terrible. It was a fiasco. Carter looked horrible as a result of it. Reagan punished him for that, criticized him for not standing up to the Iranians and all that. But behind the scenes, various political operatives in the United States, Israel, and friends of Israel in the United States, some people who were friends of Israel in the United States, they got together and started making offers of arms to the Iranians, of all things, to give them arms. And eventually these arms were going to be used in order to fund the activity of the Contras, counter-revolutionaries in South America, in Central America, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. But the timing of the release of the hostages of Iran was changed by this growing liaison cooked up by operatives in the Reagan administration and by the Israelis. They asked the Iranians, apparently, not to release the hostages while Carter was in office. Let Carter suffer for that. And if they would release them when Reagan became president, that the United States could start sending them weapons. So this is what actually happened. And it's indicated there that right after the inauguration, just a short time later, the U.S. hostages in Iran were freed. So the Iranian regime collaborated against Jimmy Carter in the United States. You could say Reagan got power through this collaboration with Iran. I would put this kind of thing in the same category as the Russian machinations that are frequently talked about on behalf of Donald Trump in the United States. I think it's the same kind of thing. It's a foreign power who's timing its events in its relations with the United States, its negotiations with the United States in order to dethrone an American leader and put another one in power in his place. So all this nasty business starts to shape up already right on the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, as is indicated by Herblock's cartoon here. Arms payoff for hostage release. Well, there it is. Herblock likes to put it on the line. Herblock, the cartoonist for the Washington Post at that time, making that argument. And then later on, by 1986, it's all going to explode and be demonstrated, in the media. Everybody's going to hear about it. The Iran-Contra Affair, that the Reagan administration was sending arms to Iran, collecting money, paying for hostages, arms for hostages, and then more than that, using that money to fund the Contras in Latin America. Kind of unsavory fellows, but anti-communists to the core. So So that's all going to come out in 1986. And all these things really have to be taken into consideration when you think about the origins of the Reagan presidency, how it all came to pass, and the shape of its perspectives um, toward the world. Ronald Reagan later on was confronted with it. He made it out he didn't know anything about it. Once again, this is Herb Bloch's view of the matter. Herb Bloch really sticks him with this. It didn't happen, and if it did happen, I didn't know about it. So that's pretty much Reagan's position there. Really stuck in an embarrassing spot. He never really talked his way out of it, but everybody dropped it and more or less let it go. Reagan was the kind of person who could say or do just about anything, and he didn't get a good deal of criticism, though. How to interpret that? The historians will probably, many years from now, will say that the entire American elite was on Reagan's side, that there was no real opposition to Reagan, and that the media therefore gave Reagan a free ride. They frequently use this term, the Teflon presidency. Nothing stuck to him. There was never any kind of responsibility for anything. But his administration represented a big turn in American politics, a big turn to the right. So you could say Nixon already represents a kind of a half turn to the right, but I would insist that Nixon is not the full turn to the right that the United States is going to take. The full turn is under Ronald Reagan. The full turn is when the cowboys come to power. Nixon represents a compromise between the Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party and the cowboy wing of the Republican Party, and Ronald Reagan does not represent any such compromise with Rockefeller, and I guess he was kind of confused as to what attitude to take toward Rockefeller. Should he dislike him? I mean, certainly the people he was associated with published a lot of horrible propaganda, anti-Rockefeller propaganda, accusing them of all sorts of things. Some of these crazy books, None Dare Call It Treason, crazy titles, and all the rest of it, make the Rockefellers out to be absolutely satanic. So, there was an antagonism, and it's hard for us to judge as historians, especially since this is well in the past now, but hard for us to judge as historians exactly how steep that antagonism was. So this is the stuff for future doctoral dissertations and books and learned articles. At any rate, Reagan represents a big turn, as I'm indicating, to the right, and immediately goes after the working class in the United States. The Patco strike, the air controllers, they wanted a little better conditions. Those are the people who control aircraft coming in and out of airports, and you'd think you'd have to give them their money in order to make sure the aircraft land properly. Reagan said, no, fire these characters, get rid of them, break the union, to hell with the organized air controllers. So a lot of people with genuine technical ability, genuine, how to put it, genuine competence, went by the board, and a lot of scabs came into the air controllers. I don't know why the planes didn't crash, all of them. They did not. Somebody will have to explain this to me. I'd love to see some really good book on it. Maybe there is one I don't know about, but why it is that the air control at our airports did not suffer from Ronald Reagan's breaking the Patco strike. So he was a great success there, a great success in breaking the strike. But of course, really bad for the unions and sort of symbolic of his attitude toward unions overall. So he went after these unions in a big way, and that's the mood of the period. Anti-union, break up union membership, maybe don't destroy them, maybe we can't pass legislation outlawing them, can't quite go as far as the fascist parties did in the 30s, but break them, cause them as much trouble as possible, cause them to lose membership, build up strike funds among the employers, so that we don't have any big strikes anymore. And it's from this time that we start to date the era of the decline of strikes. whereas we practically never see them nowadays. They used to be normal stuff. Big strikes were normal stuff after World War II, throughout the 50s, big strikes by workers, and collective bargaining and contracts were arranged and all the rest of that. But nevertheless, there was genuine, how to put it, countervailing events between union and labor, but no more now. The labor's starting to be a non-entity, and the management is starting to get its way entirely. So union membership drops off very sharply, and I guess there's no accident. Does not require interpretation that wages fell or were flat during this period. Also, we see a big change going on in the actual structure of profit making. This is a really good diagram here, a really good graph that shows the share of profits that are coming from actual employment of workers in production of things. I mean, that's the way we normally think of it, as opposed to profits that are coming from manipulation of documents, paper, buying some stock option or something like that. So the green line represents profits made in finance, and the blue line represents profits made in industry. And look what's happening. Look at this trend. At one time, manufacturing is in the saddle, and finance is far below, secondary, in terms of profit making, right at the end of World War II. And look how things are changing until we get to the point where finance actually eclipses manufacturing, and it becomes the main way to make profits. You could say the United States becomes a rentier economy at this point. As I say, it's based on rent, interest, things like that, not so much on profit made in production by the employment of people, the payment of wage labor, the production of goods for sale. Not so much in that area. And now in the realm of coupon clipping of financial transactions of various sorts. And there's the trend, the financialization, it's sometimes called, by people who write about globalization and the shifting shape of American capitalism. Financialization is now taking hold, and look at the timing of it, right, during the Reagan administration. Some Reagan administration marks the benchmark for the takeoff, you could say, of financialization. American capitalism is suffering during this period. At any rate, the American dollar is suffering abroad, and you can measure that exactly, precisely, definitionally, by the value of gold in dollars. So if the gold price is going up, the dollar is buying less in world politics, is worth less in world politics. The crisis of the dollar is the opportunity for gold. Whoever thinks the dollar is getting into trouble will invest in gold. So that's a big tendency of the 70s. Remember, during the era of the oil shocks, all these financial flows are being rearranged in order to buy oil all over the world. The dollar has really gone into eclipse and is in very bad shape. And everybody is buying gold. The gold price gets up to $800. As you can see, the lower item on the diagram, on the graph. Let's see if I've got it here. The lower item, sorry. Sorry about all this. The dark line on the graph, not the red line. The red line is adjusted for inflation and all the rest of that. But the lower line tells us the exact price at the time. So it's going up in the $800 range. So that's quite a shot. So of course, it's way above that now. But for those days, that was considered quite shocking for it to go to $800 and very much a crisis of the dollar. That's the center, the heart and soul of the crisis of capitalism that's going on, in my opinion. um, during the 1970s. Or you could say, another way of putting the same thing would be to say that the crisis of capitalism can be seen precisely in the price of gold. That'd be another way of putting it. As gold goes up. Now, it is sort of an analogy, analog to what we're saying about this kind of thinking. Take it out of economics, put it into politics. We say, you can measure the strength of the Soviet Union vis-a-vis the United States by looking at Chinese policy to them. They're going to side with the weaker. So the more the Chinese get hostile to the Soviet Union, the more you can see the Soviets are winning in the Cold War. Same kind of thinking, same kind of perspectives on these things. At any rate, these perspectives are the way I like to look at them. They produce a very dramatic conclusion. And so the United States has to fight to try to fight against gold and try to get people to get back into dollars. Try to offer higher interest rates to the investor. Don't invest in gold. Look, instead of giving you 5% on your investment, if you buy, say, American securities, instead of giving you 5%, I'll give you 10%. So that's already, in the Nixon era, we're already getting up toward 10%. But we start to get toward the end of it, and it starts to go more toward 20%. And by the time we're talking about Jimmy Carter, who brings in Paul Volcker to be his head of the Federal Reserve, interest rates are getting up toward 20%. Now, if you look at this diagram, you can see that that peak there in the center is just right around 1980. Sometimes they call that the Volcker Shock for Paul Volcker. That peak is a high for, American history, going back to the turn of the century. And that big flat line on the left of the graph, that's the $35 an ounce period for gold, during which everything was held steady and interest rates hold at about 2%. And so Paul Volcker has got them up to 20%. So very bad for business, but it cracked gold, was successful in bringing the gold price down. Sure, why would you sit there with your gold in the expectation you're going to make better than 20%? Why would you do that? No, you get into the thing that's going to give you 20%. I say get out of gold and buy American T-bills, bonds, whatever. So there's the tendency. And then the third world debt, as a result of this tremendous raise in interest rates, that means a lot of people who got loans out to buy oil from the 70s, oil shocks, a lot of people in the third world, a lot of governments in the third world have to start paying higher interest rates because a lot of these loans are adjustable rates. So they have to do with the London interbank rate, interest rates. Now this Volcker Shock, therefore, raises those payments and it's very punishing for the third world. Of course, if the third world wants to borrow money to make their payments, you see they're getting into the hole here. If they want to borrow money, the United States come back with its structural adjustment programs. Well, we'll give you the money if you do this and that with your economy, if you denationalize such and such a nationalized firm, you operate on a balanced budget, cut the budget, cut employees, institute austerity, conditionality for loans from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So that's all very punishing for the third world, and its debt burden starts to be horrendous. It's growing very, very, very dramatically, very powerfully. And then how about the finances of the United States that start in the Reagan, a tendency that starts in the Reagan era? You can see that pretty clearly too. During the post-war eras, if you take national debt and use it as a percentage of gross product in the United States, that's one way of measuring it. Of course, you could just look at national debt itself and it looks like a diagram of a rocket taking off into the stratosphere. But we try to make that less shocking by giving instead a graph of the national debt as a percentage of the national income. the GNP. But if you look at it that way, assuming that that's not exactly describing the national debt as such, but look at in terms of this percentage, you can see it isn't so bad, and it's actually going down throughout all the post-war administrations, including the Jimmy Carter administration. But then with Ronald Reagan, well, it starts to take off. In other words, Reagan's starting to turn us into a debtor nation. As a matter of fact, he assumed power with the United States as the world's leading creditor nation, and he just within about 5 or 6 years turned the United States into the world's leading debtor. Leading debtor. So he doesn't care about deficits. Deficits mean nothing to him. And the growth of the national debt then through this period, through the Reagan-Bush years, starts to. So the red line for Bush and Reagan, that takes us up to 1992. The red line shows how the United States doesn't care about this. The Democrats, though, they care. Look at Clinton coming into power in 1992. For two terms, Clinton actually tried to pay off the national debt. Why the Democrats are so earnest about this, where the Republicans are so profligate, is a bizarre thing that really needs explaining, because the opposite of their rhetoric. The Republicans are known, made a reputation since the Roosevelt era of being a party of a balanced budget, they're against deficits, worrying about the national debt, accusing the Democrats of the national debt, and all that sort of thing. The Democrats are the ones that are supposed to be profligate, Keynesian, all the rest of that. And here we've reversed roles. The Democrats, they come into office, they're trying to pay off the national debt. And as soon as we get back to the Republicans with George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, we see that the deficit starts shooting up into the heavens again, and it still continues to climb. All these things start with the Reagan administration. So these things we can note about the Reagan administration setting the tone for the U.S. economy. And one more measure, the balance of payments, United States payments throughout the world, money coming in and as opposed to money going out. So there's trade, but there's also foreign investment, there's tourism, there's troops, all these other things. And we already talked about these things. You see that up until the Reagan administration, so take a look at 1980 on this graph, up until the Reagan administration, we're a little bit concerned about this balance of payments problem. We talked about all the agonies about it, all the decisions taken as a result of it. But in the Reagan administration, they start to say, who cares? There's a little ripple, once again, as we indicated on the previous graph, for the Clinton administration. Democrats are more earnest about these things. But then, as soon as the Democrats are out of power and we get George W. Bush, then we really don't care about these things. And today we really don't care about a deficit and a balance of payments, because it's colossal, it's enormous. So there's the feeling that it doesn't matter. And as Dick Cheney once put it, Reagan taught us that deficits don't matter. Reagan taught us that deficits don't matter. Portentous words. And sometimes the fight against inflation is invoked. I find that very unimpressive, fight against inflation. But you do have to say that during the Reagan administration, the interest rates did come down. The interest rates went up, and it did have an effect on inflation. So often the argument is made that the whole point of these interest rate raises was to lower the inflation. We're fighting inflation in the United States, and you can see that happening in the early 80s as the inflation curve comes down. So things are costing up toward 10%. Go to the supermarket, things cost 10% more than they did last year. Wow, that's impressive to the consumer. That hurt Jimmy Carter, something fierce. But under the Volcker Shock, the prices start to go down. They're going to vote for Ronald Reagan, aren't they? Of course. Reagan brought the prices down. So, that does not need interpreting, for goodness sake. And And then we get them down to around 2%. And, we haven't got a big inflation problem right now. Anybody who worries about inflation, that's nothing to worry about right now. And then a couple of other little things. This graph could have been attached to that one that had to do with union membership declining and with wages going down. So here we have the real wages, which are not collapsing, but they're not going anywhere and haven't gone anywhere really since the end of the 60s, since about 1968. So the workers they're not going. And while inflation is not outrageous, what there is killing them because their wages aren't keeping up. So whatever there is of inflation is bad, very bad for the working class. But look, technology still makes it possible to have much greater productivity. Who gets the benefit of that productivity? Well, the employers get that, and the workers don't get it. Okay. Reagan understood all that. That was just the way he wanted it, just his idea of it. So very, very stern and hard on the American economy, except when it came to weapons, where he's a big Keynesian, big spender, giant arms buildup. So during the Reagan administration, we get huge developments of arms. The MX missile starts to replace those so-called heavy missiles, which the Soviets and the United States both have. The Minuteman series for the United States, the MX replaces them, new, more sophisticated missile, expensive thing. The D5 warhead for submarines, which is on your outline. The D5 is essentially a missile as good as the MX, which goes on submarines, which means that it's a mobile platform, so it's invulnerable, and it is able to knock out hard targets, at least presumably knock out hard targets. That's capable of making a counterforce strike, how to put it, a damage-limiting reduction of the ability of the enemy to use his weapons. So very, very threatening, very, very threatening thing. And these are all things are all coming into the American arsenal with the Ronald Reagan arms buildup. And then so-called ET weapons, which were emerging technology weapons, which were in view in the first Iraq War in 1991. Reagan starts throwing a lot of money into those things. So those are smart munitions of various kinds, infrared devices, and all these things to make the battlefield smarter and produce a much better anti-tank capability than was the case in the past. The United States is way ahead of the Soviet Union, by the way, in this category, but the Soviets are a little bit behind. I shouldn't say way ahead, but the United States is ahead. And the Soviets are gaining in this, but they're behind, always behind the United States in this aspect of technology. And then Pershing II rockets introduced into Europe, which have a flight time of maybe, I don't know, 10 minutes or something, 10 or 15 minutes to Moscow. Wow, very threatening, enormously threatening. That's the whole idea of all of this. Scare Moscow, threaten Moscow. Moscow's gaining on us in various ways, but we've still got the capability of producing weapons. So we can throw this at them and have an impact on them, presumably. And along with those go ground-launched cruise missiles, which might be fired in the very first stages of an all-out nuclear exchange with the Soviets. These are stationed in Europe, and they fly under radar. And so once again, they could be used in a surprise attack, and a decapitating or otherwise anti-weapon counterforce, first strike. And absolutely the most shocking of all, the Strategic Defense Initiative for weapons in space that are going to be able to pick up even the very best missiles in their flight to the United States and the Soviet Union and destroy them en route, or perhaps even destroy them as they're ascending from the Soviet Union. Because these satellites are going to be flying right over Soviet territory, maybe picking up the missile telemetry and knocking these missiles out. So there's a Reagan arms buildup, enormously shocking, you might say, or at any rate intended to be enormously shocking to the Soviets. And I think it succeeded, because I followed the Soviet literature through this period pretty assiduously. And they definitely took note. You have to say they took note of these things. So that impressed them. Mainly what they're worried about is the threat that the United States weapons may give the United States the capability of a first strike. It's not so much that the United States would actually make a first strike, although you have to worry about that. If the other person can make a first strike against you and get away with it with nuclear weapons. But you have to worry about what that means politically, because if they can do that, and there's a political crisis, and they say, let's not bring nuclear weapons into play, partner, look you in the eye, you have to back off. If you're afraid they have a real first strike capability. Moreover, they start acting kind of irresponsibly, irrationally even, you got to really worry about that if you think they have something approaching a first strike capability. I don't think anybody really had it, nor can have it today to win a nuclear war. No. I would insist on that and argue into the night, bore you to death with it, that nobody can win. These things don't really accomplish that, but they threaten it. They raise the question. That's something you have to think about if you're on the other side. So it's a huge arms buildup designed to frighten the Soviet Union, or maybe some have argued, as a matter of fact, Soviet leadership argued exactly this point. These things are designed to make us spend all our money trying to keep up in this category. Whereas we'd like to spend some money on making the life of our people better, we have to spend it trying to keep up with you Americans and all your exotic threats. Our technology is good, but it's not quite as good as yours, and you have a lot of money to throw into these things, and we don't quite have the resources that you do, although we're formidable enough. But that's not good enough if you're going to be threatening these things. So maybe you, continuing this Soviet thought here, you Americans are engaging in what might be called an exhaustion strategy. You're trying to exhaust us and wear us out. I say this because when Gorbachev finally did come to power in the early 80s, he made, I don't know how many speeches. I had to run through all these speeches, and he was constantly saying, you're not going to exhaust us. Don't think this exhaustion strategy is going to work. Don't think all your weapon spending is going to wear us out, blah, 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 blah. It's not going to bother us. We'll always have ways, no matter how much you spend, we'll always have ways of dealing with it. Even SDI, even if you have a ballistic missile defense, we can still overcome it by asymmetrical means. We can, increase the warheads and all that sort of thing. They're constantly saying that they're not worried about it, which tells me they're worried to death about it, especially the more they talk about it. So let's see, what's the bottom line in this paragraph here? What am I saying? I guess I'm saying the Reagan arms buildup, even though it might have been thought of as something totally bizarre in a way, and even more so, might have been said, and as a matter of fact, I think I was one of the people who said this, that it's just an alibi. It's just an alibi. They're losing all over the world, these capitalists, and all they can think of is to build a weapon. Haven't we seen this tendency throughout the course? The communism gains China, so we build, the United States, capitalism builds an H-bomb without exactly having a military mission for the thing, but it's some way of responding. An alibi, you could argue. Just a way of answering people who say, what are you going to do about it? We'll build another weapon. We lost a country, we'll build a weapon. It's that kind of thought. Well, anyhow, I had this thought, but even if you have this thought, that is still quite a shocking thing to present the Soviets with, and something they certainly can't get used to. Have to try to use all of their devices, as Gorbachev will, to try to disarm this somehow. Try to come to terms with the Americans. I mean, try pleading, if possible, crawling on your belly, try to appeal to their public opinion, try to, try to make some kind of move in diplomacy that will diffuse this threat posed by this seemingly senseless, I think you could argue, quite senseless, arms buildup. All right, so that's an interesting question. I certainly can't exhaust that topic in the time we have allotted for that. So, I mean, one can certainly write a book about this, and without padding, in my opinion. It's a powerful topic. But that's the Reagan arms buildup, and that's what I think it was designed to accomplish. One artist has it that Reagan really can't accomplish anything, really, except to throw guns at a problem. He just builds every gun that he can possibly, every weapon he can possibly think of. It's a really colossal image that is put forward by this artist. Or another way of putting it, put it in terms of the famous film by Stanley Kubrick, Dr. Strangelove, which at the end of this film, at the end of this film, Slim Pickens as the captain of a bomber attacking a missile site. That's the film premise. As he drops a bomb, gets on top of the thing and rides down, waving his cowboy hat over his head. It's the cowboy mentality, if you will. And there's Reagan. Mommy, that's one of his terms of endearment for his wife. At the same time, the question comes up, who's going to fight these communists? After all, we can threaten them, but somebody has to fight them on the ground. And if our position is really as unpopular, that is to say, if communism really manages to appeal to various movements and people, states, small states in the third world in such a way as to gain their allegiance, the only way to fight them on their own terms, meet them in the theater and in kind, as Cyrus Vance would have put it during the Carter administration, is to have the better political position, to win their hearts and minds, so to speak. But suppose you can't win their hearts and minds. Suppose you've lost their hearts and minds. I mean, that's the fact. The United States has lost their hearts and minds during the 70s. It did not win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese. And these other revolutions, it's kind of the same story. Then you just have to use your money, employ money in this thing, and buy whatever kind of people you can buy in order to oppose the communists. I mean, I admit it's not much from the standpoint of politics. Here I'm speaking as if I were Reagan, trying to explain myself to my creator. I admit he might have said it's kind of bankrupt politically to tie in with these horrible characters all around the world just because they hate communism. Maybe they hate communism for the same reason they hate us. They maybe hate all enlightenment. Maybe they put the communists in the United States, everybody since the 18th century, in the Western tradition of enlightenment, and not religious or other fanaticism. Maybe they hate them all equally and are just taking our money in order to get started in fighting everybody. Well, fight the communists first and get to you folks later on. It turns out to be more or less the case for these jihadis, various other characters that were employed by the Reagan administration. And the Reagan administration even had a term for it. It was a term of liberation for the world. It was going for some kind of world liberation. Soviets called it the doctrine of globalism, global interventionism, and others have called it others have called it the Reagan Doctrine. If there is such a thing as a Reagan Doctrine, what is this doctrine? The Reagan Doctrine is we'll employ any force, we'll pay for any insurrectionists or opponents, we'll put arms in their hands, anybody who will fight communism. Any anti-communist is our friend. We hate communism. Imagine if we'd taken that attitude in the 30s toward Hitler and fascism. Well, these people are anti-communists, final analysis, to bring them together. No, we didn't take that attitude. I think there were people in the world, certainly in the Western world, who would have taken exactly this attitude toward the communists and said that Hitler and Mussolini and other fascists in the world, they're unsavory, but they're on our side. Let's help them. I think there were people. We can have a big discussion about who it was, were they powerful, all the rest of that. But at any rate, there's this perspective, this alternate perspective from the 30s. And here it is in Reagan's America, this perspective. And Reagan, of course, in his enthusiasm, at one point in 1985, said they were just like our founding fathers. Ouch. Extraordinary idea. So there he is talking with all of these jihadis. He's going to be involved with every kind of weird and semi-criminal organization in the world, going to be giving them money. And that's going to be more or less the Reagan Doctrine. And the United States has not entirely abandoned this view of things, that anybody who fights communism is our friend. Or put it in a slightly different way, for the post-Cold War period, anybody who fights against authoritarianism or against autocracy, using the word autocracy instead of communism. Anybody who fights against autocracy, such as the Iranians profess, might be argued, is our friend. So that's the big thing that Reagan gave to the world with this Reagan Doctrine of 1983. What were the cultural stakes of this thing? I mean, it's one thing to be throwing money at these people who politically and spiritually we have nothing in common with, and who probably hate us as much as they hate the others, but are just using us to get this weaponry. People who ended up turning these weapons and resources against us in maybe the biggest act of terror, if we got it right, maybe the biggest act of terror in American history. And all because we're fighting against the communists. We've just got to give them weapons. Got to inject this money into these movements. Can't quit it. Can't quit it. And we got to support them in Latin America, most of all. Instead of coming to terms with these radical regimes, I think you could easily come to terms with them. They're dying to come to terms. Of course, they're pretty radical, though. So anybody who did come to terms with them, as I, of course, would have done, would have to explain it in the United States to those who said the communists are just using us. And we'd have to, that's an argument you'd have to face. You know, that's not, you can't just shake that off. That's an argument you'd have to face. Even so, I think no matter how radical any of the people from this period were, and no matter how much they hated the United States, you could argue. In fact, I would argue this. No matter how radical they were, it was still possible to come to terms with them. And I would also say to an elite audience, I would point out to them that, as a matter of fact, this will, you may not believe it, but this will give you more influence with them than you will have by fighting them, especially if you don't completely defeat them. Okay, so that's a tendency that develops in world politics from this point. I don't know, it's, in terms of a place like Afghanistan, it's against the Enlightenment. You know, you're giving money and spiritual support to people who want to cover women from head to toe, who want to throw acid in their face. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, people like that, throw acid in women's faces if they don't cover themselves up. Wow. We're helping those people because they've got to fight communism. So this is bad news stuff, in my opinion. If you permit me my opinion, this is very bad news. And at the end of the thing, Reagan professed straightforwardly that he'd gone over to a point of view that more or less sided with the richest people in the United States and said, I want a country where a man can make money. That's the kind of country that America is, a country that can, where a man can make money, a man can get rich. If we stop becoming a country where you can get rich, that's a spiritual death for the United States. But, when you put it that way, when you think of things that way, then you start to organize everything around that principle. And you end up saying that religion is just great, and especially religious fanatics who preach and love money. So you start arguing God is on our side, practically. Or at any rate, that's certainly the logic of it. You start to argue that God wants to side with the rich. This is really a philosophical dilemma, if you think that way. But there are those in the United States who think that way today. And they really found their president, I think, with Ronald Reagan. A conception of religion, a conception of God's motivations about these things. In the Bible, God let Pharaoh do all sorts of horrible things to the children of Israel. Plagues and all sorts of terrible things. The notion that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, that God saw this conflict in such a way that he actually was responsible for it, for the persecution of his own people. He made it possible so that in their sufferings, they could somehow react in such a way as to please him. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Does God want the employment of everything, every possible means? Well, suppose God is dead. A lot of people who support this kind of extreme view of plutocracy do take the view that God is dead. That it's not God's work that we do. Although in the United States, plutocracy is always supported by extremes of religion. But the viewpoint of Nietzsche, for example, that one ought to have contempt for pity. God is dead. Forget God. Forget a morality based on Christianity and based on slavery. Forget slave morality. The better morality is master morality. So in his famous book, Genealogy of Morals, he makes essentially this argument. He likes the master morality of the Romans, who didn't give a damn about anything. Vae victis, they said. Woe to the conquered. Woe to the conquered. Woe to the losers, they said. Nixon said, or I should say Nixon, Nietzsche, started with an N. Nietzsche said, I despise democracy because it is the means by which the cattle become the masters. Down with democracy. Down with Harriet Beecher Stowe and all those sob sisters that sympathize with the slaves in America. Losers. There's only winning in this world. Nietzsche on the left and Ayn Rand, who some people say is a kind of American Nietzsche, but who puts it in terms of money. Nietzsche didn't put it in terms of money. She does. And she says, the plutocrats, selfishness, that's the only thing that counts. Well, in some ways, you can hardly deny that selfishness is important. Everybody's pretty selfish, except with our children. And we don't feel that way about our children. With our children, we're ready to be martyrs. But in other things, we're pretty selfish. And Ayn Rand publishes these books that are read by American plutocratic statesmen, like Paul Ryan, for example, who said he's a disciple of Ayn Rand. Alan Greenspan, who was actually a follower of Ayn Rand and was part of her circle of intimates. They use these Nietzschean ideas with regard to money and say the capitalist is the personality who represents winning and everything that's sublime in life. Woe to the losers. And some people criticize. Some people criticize Ayn Rand. And others take the view that this notion of plutocracy in the United States is kind of a dead end. You really cannot win, you cannot succeed. That history may not be on the side of this plutocratic worldview. I don't know about that. That's a question we could argue at some length. We would, put on our berets and smoke these strong cigarettes and drink very strong coffee, argue into the night about these philosophical questions. But at least one question we can ask of a slightly less ambitious character is, did Reagan win? Did rollback succeed? He was going to roll back communism. He's going to make a huge break, going to roll back communism. Did he succeed in Central America? Slightly, but not completely. So he did not destroy communism in Central America or the Caribbean. Did he succeed in Afghanistan? To a considerable degree, but not completely. I don't think we can explain the whole thing in Afghanistan entirely in terms of the success of Reagan's policy, although we have to give it its due as historians, that it was considerably successful. And we have to evaluate the role it played in subsequent events. But those events, and they are the events that make the case that Ronald Reagan is a great president and a great figure in history, have to do with the Gorbachev reforms and the fall of communism in Russia. Without that, we don't have an argument for the greatness of Ronald Reagan. The greatness of Ronald Reagan argument then depends on Mikhail Gorbachev. It depends on Reagan's great victory, so to speak, over communism. But really it was done by people other than Reagan, done by Mikhail Gorbachev, I think. At any rate, let's examine that proposition as we press on. The next question that we take up is Gorbachev's role in all of this. Does Gorbachev provide an answer to Reagan? Or did Gorbachev, in the end, enable Reagan? Did Gorbachev make Reagan into a world historical personality that Americans revere? Okay, those are the questions we have to take up next. And they have to do with the fall of the Soviet Union. And that's the topic that we'll be turning to.